What are Samus's aspirations, history, and fears? Nintendo had appreciated the questions but never thought about them before and ultimately didn't have a lot of answers. In the end, they felt uncomfortable with our team being the ones to propose those answers. Brad Foxhaven, who was a producer on the Metroid film intended to be directed by John Woo, told this to IGN in 2012. Not long after the cancellation of the film, Yoshio Sakamoto, co-creator of the Metroid franchise, would approach Yosuke Hayashi of Team Ninja about creating a brand new entry in the franchise for the Wii. The desire was to create a Metroid game that would please old fans while drawing in new players, a common goal for Nintendo after their motion control system found its way into so many living rooms. In order to accomplish this, Sakamoto and Hayashi worked hard at developing an NES game with current technology, limiting themselves to developing a satisfying action game with just the Wii remote. But Sakamoto also believed that the game would need a greater emphasis on story to capture a new audience, one that would have to explain what Metroid was to new players while exploring new themes for longtime fans. He broke away from the usual Nintendo method of game design, starting with the story rather than developing the core gameplay first and tying it all together thematically towards the end. While the sales numbers weren't horrible, Other M failed to find a new audience and only managed to frustrate, or even enrage, fans. In Japan, players were displeased by the copious amounts of dialogue and linearity. In the West, fans were particularly angered by the portrayal of Samus, her subservience to the character Adam Malkovich, and the frustrating limitations imposed upon her abilities in order to serve the narrative. In the end, based on what sales data is available online, Other M had failed to crack the 2 million mark, a number only managed by the original Metroid on the NES and the very first Metroid Prime on the GameCube. So what happened? Is Other M a bad game altogether? Is it a bad Metroid game? Did Nintendo truly screw up the story? To answer these questions, I'll have to dig deep into several major entries in the Metroid series over the last 20 years, so be warned, there will be story and gameplay spoilers for Super Metroid, Metroid Prime, Metroid Fusion, and Metroid Other M ahead. While researching this episode, I discovered that I had been carrying a number of false assumptions about Samus Aran's history. So before discussing the games critically, I want to make sure we're all on the same page as to what, according to Nintendo, the story to this franchise is. To begin with, is Samus Aran really a bounty hunter? Looking back at the instruction manuals for the original games reveals that Samus has essentially been under the employ of the Galactic Federation, at least for the first 2 games. According to the first Metroid's manual, the Galactic Federation called together a group of great and courageous warriors known as Space Hunters, a seeming combination of mercenaries and special operations troops. Samus was identified as one of these soldiers, and in the first 2 games was the one ordered to go forth and eradicate the space pirate and Metroid menace. It is with this context that Samus Aran's history as a soldier of the Galactic Federation makes a bit more sense. It always seemed a strange leap in continuity for me that Samus would have been trained and raised by the Chozo, yet in Metroid Fusion she suddenly has a former commanding officer who, detailed in Other M, turned out to be a surrogate father during her younger years. For some reason, Samus was permitted to keep her Chozo armor despite the fact that the Galactic Federation military is underhanded enough to try and revive the Metroids in secret. Wouldn't such a military try to confiscate Samus's armor to reverse engineer? Wouldn't a military contract require such a loyalty out of their soldier as to hand over the armor? Furthermore, why don't the Chozo have any significance to Samus and Other M? It is common knowledge that Samus was raised by the Chozo as a child, right? Well, it turns out the Chozo weren't mentioned until the Super Metroid instruction manual, and only as an ancient race immortalized by the statues left behind on Zebes. The manual for Metroid 2 merely referred to them as artifactor statues, and the first game's manual didn't really make special note of them at all. Using the games and their manuals as the sole guide to the series' story, players won't know that Samus was raised by the Chozo, or who the Chozo really were, until Metroid Prime. It is in that game's manual that we first read about Samus growing up on a colony destroyed by space pirates, only to be rescued and raised by the Chozo. So where did this history come from? How did it become Nintendo's official background? It all seems to link back to the Nintendo Power comic, an adaptation of Super Metroid by Benimaru Ito. Whether he came up with this origin or was given to him by Nintendo is unclear, at least based on what information I could find. What is clear is that names and details, such as Samus's home colony being named K2L, remain consistent between the comic and the Metroid Prime instruction manual. It is at Metroid Prime where the continuity seems to diverge, however. Retro Studios developed the Chozo as an ancient and rather mystical race that fused technology with nature upon the planet of Talon 4. More so, Retro interpreted the Space Pirates as a militaristic organization with harsh penalties and a habit of reverse engineering technology. While they had failed to replicate Samus Aran's power suit, they were able to imitate her power, wave, ice, and plasma beam energies. Ridley is an important member to their organization, but he is not their leader within the Prime continuity. However, in 2002, coinciding with the simultaneous release of Metroid Prime and Metroid Fusion, Nintendo released an online comic in Japan that provided additional details to the Metroid universe, notably that the Chozo created the mother brain computer that would come to lead the Space Pirates of Zebes, and that the Chozo bioengineered the Metroids to combat the X-Parasite, the new antagonist introduced in Fusion. The comic was further developed to help promote the release of Metroid Zero Mission on the Game Boy Advance, introducing the character of Adam Malkovich as well as describing the Space Pirates as a hive mind that requires a master. This idea will be developed further within Other M, and present a major contradiction with the behavior of Space Pirates throughout the Prime series. Of course, American or European players won't be able to obtain this information without seeking unofficial translations online. It's an unusual decision seeing as Metroid has always sold better in the West, yet Western players are left in the dark. Simultaneously, Yoshio Sakamoto had little involvement in the development of the Prime series, and as a result may have been unaware of how Retro was choosing to develop and portray the Chozo, the Space Pirates, and the Galactic Federation beyond superficial design choices. Either way, his decision to follow the space pirate hive mind hierarchy of the Japanese comic over Retro's rather intelligent militaristic species is a clear indication that Sakamoto does not care too much about Retro's own contributions to the setting. Technically, this inconsistency has been hand-waved away, addressing the Zebesians as a subgroup of space pirates. It's very dismissive and after the fact, but also not surprising since everyone, within and outside of Nintendo, have also forgotten such details as Samus originally being described as a cyborg in the first Metroid's manual. At any rate, for all intents and purposes, Sakamoto chose to follow the continuity of the comics and work independently of Retro when establishing the story to Other M, a move that might ultimately prove to have been a mistake. Giving a traditionally silent protagonist a voice and personality is always going to be a difficult task for any creator. Players will have developed a personality in their own minds with their own ideas of strength and struggle. For many Western players, I imagine the pragmatic and strong-willed personality of Ellen Ripley was projected onto Samus, fitting since the Alien films are a major influence on the game's development. Reading the Japanese comics, however, reveal a stubborn and brash heroine that could just as well be Buffy the Vampire Slayer in space. A portrayal I'm not particularly fond of myself, as it occasionally makes Samus seem as if she's more about bronze and less about brains, but at least gives her a personality. When Yoshio Sakamoto finally gave Samus more of a voice in Metroid Fusion, her personality was no deeper than a Saturday morning cartoon action hero. The closest we get is the form of the SAX, a parasitic clone of Samus and her armor. Stripping the humanity away from Samus and focusing on her abilities as a total war machine is baiting the hook to see what kind of existential crisis bites first. Is she truly a protector of the galaxy, or has she been nothing more than the Galactic Federation's puppet of war? Of course, such a plot is an awful lot to ask of a short side-scrolling action game, one where the protagonist having speech at all was met with mixed reception. So the game instead addressed the SAX as bad, and Samus was displeased with the fact that no one told her the Metroids were being cloned. So she sets off to do the right thing, and no character is truly established, let alone developed, with the exception of Adam Malkovich. We don't meet him directly, but Samus speaks of him throughout the game, her former commanding officer that respectfully referred to her as Lady, and saved her life at the cost of his own. Perhaps this should have been the greatest warning of what was coming with Other M. Samus finally gets the chance to speak, and she only has words for this man that had never existed before, a man that would become the central character to Metroid Other M. That, I believe, is the core problem. Other M isn't really about Samus, or even about the Metroid. It's an explanation for how and why Adam Malkovich saved Samus's life. Most of her reflections on the past focus on Adam as a mentor. She completely yields to Adam's authority despite the fact that she is no longer a part of the Galactic Federation military. A great big hullabaloo is made over Adam's choice to stop Samus from risking her own life, sacrificing himself to rid the station of a genetically modified Metroid menace. Even the epilogue is nothing more than an errand to retrieve Adam's helmet.
Sorry for keeping you waiting, Adam. Let's go home.
No amount of Samus's admiration is going to work, though. Her fondness for Adam runs counter to the player's desires, namely that of having the heat-resistant variosuit equipped while running through a magma-flooded artificial volcano. You can't just expect the player to respect and like a character that is restricting their freedom of choice.
Samus, looks like I'm gonna need to ask for your cooperation on this mission, but I'm also gonna have to ask that you follow my commands. You don't move unless I say so, and you don't fire until I say so. Regarding auxiliary weapons, the use of bombs has been authorized. As far as your other weapons go, we will continue to investigate and authorize use as we can. Samus, Start by searching areas you can access with your current equipment. We'll determine weapon and equipment authorization after we get a better understanding of the situation.
The surrogate parent angle is not a bad one to try and approach. The fight to be seen as an equal peer in the eyes of a parent is a struggle that can continue throughout adulthood, and now that Samus has plenty of experience acting on her own, there is plenty of reason for her to disagree with Adam. If we even got to hear her for a moment question why she cannot equip her ice beam while the squad kept icers on hand, we might be able to respect her. Give us a glimpse of a Samus with her own ideas and thoughts and the stubborn independent will to see them through. Kind of like,
Get them out of there! Do it now!
Shut up!
Hicks, whoever's left, get the
Just
hell
shut
out
up!
of there! God damn it!
Hold on, Newt. Ripley, what the hell are you doing?
exactly! Give Samus conflict with the rest of the Federation troops beyond his trust of the token mysterious traitor.
I decided to call the traitor the Deleter.
That name is stupid. We're calling him traitor. Even the one moment the game does try to develop conflict, where Adam is revealed to be the author of this brand new Metroid cloning program, it is solved in the very next cutscene with little argument. Yes, he was tasked with creating an outline for such a program, but he also advised against it. Oh, Adam, you're so dreamy. I knew you couldn't be the traitor. Now, to be fair, the game tries to tackle some sort of theme about motherhood as well. The entire space station that Samus is trying to save has gone to hell because Melissa Bergman, an artificial AI developed to replicate the Mother Brain, former leader of the Space Pirates, had begun to develop a will of her own and ultimately went berserk when the Galactic Federation threatened her well-being. Madeline Bergman, the scientist that chose to take on the role of Melissa's surrogate mother, holds herself responsible because, I don't know, what has science done, I guess. Melissa Bergman, having the ability to control the creatures on the space station, views them as her own children. So we have a mother to a mother that is named after the Mother Brain, all of whom's initials are MB, with Samus frequently recounting the final sacrifice of the Metroid hatchling, which she is frequently referring to as the baby.
The baby. The baby. The baby. The baby.
Oh yeah, and if you shift the M from other M to the front, you get mother. I'm sure somewhere in there is an effective story with a strong theme of motherhood, but unfortunately it's nowhere to be found in the end product. All of this information is saved until the very end, delivered in one giant exposition dump. We don't really get any reflection of Samus's thoughts towards the hatchling as a child of her own, and Melissa Bergman's, or MB's, choice to go full tilt evil is the closest we have to some sort of commentary of a daughter scorned or a mother bear's raging fury. Even then, it's delivered as exposition and explanation, and it comes at the very end of a game whose story seesaws between admiration over Adam and overwhelming concern for who this mysteriously well-telegraphed traitor could be. If I were an even more cynical man, I'd claim that Other M is Nintendo's effort to get fans to shut up about silent protagonists being outdated. They took a cult favorite character of theirs and made her into a subservient, lifeless shell of a dullard. Oh yeah, did I forget to mention that Samus is a bit of an idiot?
This bottle ship is under management of the Galactic Federation. In these facilities, life forms from each planet have been raised and researched as possible bioweapons.
Adam, was the Galactic Federation experimenting with bioweapons?
The computer just fucking told you, you dumb broad! Samus is saved by Adam, whom she desperately admires. When the Galactic Federation is about to sweep things under the rug, Anthony, one of the soldiers on board and also an old friend, has to come in and save the day. The same Anthony that has to save Samus from having a panic attack over Ridley, a monster that she has already defeated twice, 4 times if you count the Prime games in continuity. Yes, I understand, childhood trauma, yada yada, but I'd have preferred our tough-as-nails bounty hunter to freak out in a much more fitting manner. Yes! Like that! Metroid Other M is a complete assassination of any semblance of character Samus could have had. Sakamoto gave Samus a voice, and it does nothing but tell us about the incredible achievements and significance of other characters. The tragedy is it didn't have to be this way. Let's go further, back to Super Metroid, before the hatchling saved Samus's life. Let us recall that her mission of genocide concluded with a moment of compassion and mercy, sparing the life of the final Metroid. A decision that, despite the possibilities for good, ultimately results in the loss of lives as the space pirates steal the hatchling away. Now Samus has those lives weighing on her conscience, so she goes through all of Zebes fighting these monsters to finally defeat Ridley and find the hatchling is no longer in its container. She journeys down to Turian, fighting several Metroid clones until she reaches a section filled with dust and ash. Lifeless forms crumble to sand before her, and then she witnesses what has become of the hatchling. It has grown vicious, nearly killing her in a desperate need to feed its hunger. At the last moment, the hatchling recognizes her and flees in what looks to be shame. Why else flee from your mother, after all? Now, while the hatchling does save Samus at the game's end, it begs the question of whether the hatchling would have stopped seeing Samus as its mother at some point. Would there have been a time where it became overcome by its hunger? Was Samus's compassion for this hatchling a weakness that could have brought about the end of civilization? Should she have just slain the hatchling? And aren't these great questions to bring into a sequel featuring a clone of Samus stripped of all humanity and left as nothing more than a tool of war and genocide? But we didn't get that Samus. Forced to face such interesting internal conflicts, instead we got Samus, a dull and monotone subservient that can't even tell some old schmuck from the Galactic Federation to shove his own fat head up his ass. Metroid Prime didn't really focus on Samus Aran. It's one of the most significant differences that set it apart from Fusion at the time and would later contrast it with Other M. The game is instead about Talon 4, a peaceful refuge for the wary Chozo race, and how the radioactive Phazon twisted this blissful home into something dark and sinister. Samus is mentioned within the writings of the Chozo, but only as a savior prophesied to banish the darkness. Samus is nothing more than a vehicle or avatar for the player, carrying them through this adventure. It could be that such a narrative direction is more fitting for the Metroid franchise. Since the very first game, the series has focused on exploration, and by Super Metroid that included environmental storytelling. Take Samus's arrival in Zebes as an example. Crateria is hollow and deserted, the ruined halls of Turian still bearing the scars from the climactic battle against the Mother Brain. Upon retrieval of the Morph Ball, a security light suddenly responds. Something is alive down there after all, and as Samus ascends the elevator, a once dark and powerless room is lit up. It doesn't matter that the eerie music is gone now, that the once dead room is now sprung to life informs the player of all they need to know. They are not alone. There are a number of small moments like this. Arriving in Meridia reveals the Metoids, failed clones of the Metroids by the space pirates, indicating that they've already begun experimentation. Upon defeating Ridley, the player discovers the original container that housed the hatchling has long since shattered, confirming that the pirates are already experimenting. This leads to the earlier discussed encounter with the hatchling, where the player gets to witness the aftermath of the creature's feeding habits. It's through such small details and denizens that Zebes feels like a dynamic world. Each section is also interconnected to another, with various tunnels and passageways between Crateria, Brinstar, Norfair, and Meridia present. By the latter half of the game, the player is able to look at the map and determine several routes to a single destination, all taking them through several parts of the world. This allows Zebes to feel like one seamlessly connected whole, a place well lived in and, most importantly, a place to become familiar with. Metroid Fusion, on the other hand, decides to take its space station setting and use that as a method to keep these portions of the world separated. Each zone is partitioned into themed sectors. This was likely to reduce how long a player might wander around if they are lost or uncertain of where to go. Instead of wasting time wandering an entire map in confusion, they'll be focused on just one portion of the game world. It's not quite holding a player's hand so much as it is putting blinders on, forcing them to look in a single place for their solution. As a result, the game doesn't truly open up until the player is closer to the end, where it is possible to discover access tunnels between each sector. While this approach was certainly more user-friendly, it emphasized just how artificial this game world was. I don't just mean manufactured on the space station to resemble Zebes, but more that there's a fire level, water level, and other such themes because it's a video game. A lot of video games have such themed levels to create a sense of variety, but there's no real effort to disguise that purpose here. The space station is just a generic location for Samus to have her adventure, which makes the space station itself less interesting. Of course, the game didn't have to become more linear in order to be more user-friendly either. Metroid Prime implements a hint system that experienced players can shut off if they so desire. This hint system will give new players a general idea of where to go, similarly to the objective system in Metroid Fusion. There was no way for players to shut off the objectives in Fusion, however, and even if they could, the game relies upon it to reinforce its linearity. The importance of the map should not be underestimated either. It's through the map that the player is able to mentally zoom out and see how separate rooms are connected, constructing relational data that will help in backtracking and recalling hidden upgrades. Perhaps after obtaining the grappling hook, a single glance at the map is all that is required for the player to remember which rooms they couldn't fully explore. Metroid Prime takes this a step further by having each portion of the map more closely resemble the room it is representing, assisting the player in mentally backtracking through entire sections rather than physically doing so. Metroid Prime's key contribution, however, was to take the environmental narrative style of Super Metroid and to modernize it with similar narrative choices of Western games like Half-Life and System Shock. For example, before you fight the Queen Parasite on board the frigate, you see a few dead space pirates in the prior room. Upon opening the door, you see piles of pirate corpses gathered in the hall exiting the Queen Parasite's chamber. With these visual aids, it's possible to gather that the door was shut by the few survivors on the inside of the room, condemning the remaining pirates in the Queen's chamber to death. It not only conveys a story to the player, but provides a glimpse into the Darwinistic philosophies on strength and survival of the space pirates. The various data logs all but confirm such insights, as well as revealing more about the Chozo and even providing characteristics to the different creatures of Talon. All of these elements lend to a much more detailed and rich world and setting, built upon simple ideas that began in Super Metroid. So what of Metroid Other M? Well, in a lot of ways it feels like Sakamoto set out to recreate Metroid Fusion when he wrote Other M. Once more, Samus finds herself on a space station, this time referred to as the Bottle Ship, that is designed to engineer life forms into bioweapons, particularly by cloning the Metroids using the hatchling's DNA that had been on Samus's armored suit. With Fusion, I was willing to be forgiving that few of the locations seemed designed truly to house such life forms. A 2D side-scroller is going to face limitations after all. However, with Other M, I find it difficult not to be more critical. The majority of these locations do not seem suited to house organic life, particularly when those life forms are being weaponized. Why would you have an entire facility in the middle of an environment intended to replicate a planet's surface so that it may house these hostile organic life forms? Why would said environment have a hatch that leads to another lava-based environment? It's true that Metroid Prime also has these sorts of connections and environments, but contextually, these locations are at least built into an already existing planet. This space station was supposedly designed with the purpose of raising life forms in artificial domes, yet in order to get around the station, Samus must frequently cut through these areas filled with hostile creatures. Yes, the new Mother Brain released all of these creatures into the station, but that doesn't change the fact that scientists are still forced and expected to enter territories that look as if they're designed for this wildlife to roam free. Furthermore, while Metroid Fusion had very few connections between its different sectors, there are no connections between the different sectors in Other M. They only connect in some way to the hub world, with the one exception of dropping into the lava sector. That passage is permanently removed afterward, however. The Bottle Ship feels like it exists for no purpose but to be an environment built for a video game. It doesn't feel like a believable world, even within the context of its own rules. And why should it? That's not the emphasis here. The only reason Samus is here is so she can have her story about Adam Malkovich. So, like Fusion, Other M is designed in a linear fashion and comes equipped with a mandatory hint system pointing Samus to her next objective. The map is stuck on a barely detailed top-down perspective view, rather than providing the level of detail that a more powerful game system can afford, such as the Prime map provides. Despite the addition of a first-person perspective, there are few environmental details that really add any depth to the game's setting or story. As a result, the world of Zebez, despite being part of an earlier game with fewer narrative capabilities, managed to be a more interesting and dynamic setting than either sequel Sakamoto had written. Metroid Prime, on the other hand, created a memorable world within Talon 4, as well as finally adding some character and depth to both Chozo and Space Pirate races. Perhaps if we got to learn more about the Galactic Federation, Other M would have been better. After all, there's no reason there couldn't have been data logs scattered throughout the Bottle Ship, detailing the lives of different research scientists or maintenance staff on board. Instead, the Galactic Federation is still a vague entity, and one in which we've only seen humans being a part of, even though they're supposedly a collection of different races. Other M's story might be aggravating, insulting, and nonsensical, but the setting itself is just boring and bland. While this is a disappointment to longtime series fans, I have to wonder what reason any new players would want to return to this world. There's nothing creative here, nothing interesting, and by relying so heavily on details of Samus's past, it is bound to be confusing. Imagine a player that has no clue who Samus is, seeing her wear armor completely different from everyone else in the Galactic Federation. A simple data log could have answered this question, but instead it is left unaddressed. In the end, the Bottle Ship is a complete failure as a captivating setting. As noted earlier, both Fusion and Other M were more linear experiences in order to be more user-friendly. Fusion actually followed a pattern similar to Super Metroid, which started out by introducing the player to vertical hub worlds with an assortment of locked doors. It slowly introduced the player to larger, more cavernous tunnels over time, until dropping the player into the completely open and uncharted Meridia. Fusion is a much more strict version of this, but the approach is largely the same. As the game progresses, the player is more and more frequently placed into scenarios without an objective marker, and at the end is left to discover new and hidden pathways concealed from the map. So while the game doesn't expect the player to understand how to play a Metroid game at the start, it certainly does expect them to learn. However, there are also several moments where the game will lock doors that might normally be opened, forcing the player in a specific direction. This is especially true at the end, when the player is directed to their final objective and all other doors are locked, preventing the player from backtracking and finding other upgrades. This is a risky move on Nintendo's part, as many players may not have found the secret passages between each sector, nor are they aware that they're approaching the game's climax and will be locked out of all other areas. This means the player could be locked into a fight with the SAX or the Omega Metroid without enough health or equipment to survive, not without multiple tries at least. Not only is this infuriating to any classic Metroid player, it's bound to frustrate any new players, assuming they've even been patient enough to make it that far. Other M implements the same exact design choices. In fact, it is impossible to get 100% item completion before the end credits, as you don't get the power bomb until fighting the Metroid Queen, the second to final encounter before the end of the game. Of course, Samus returns to the bottle ship after the credits, but players won't be aware of that on their first playthrough. And once the player returns, they're still locked to a certain path of progress. If they reach certain doors or obstacles, they will be unable to go back and grab other items they may have missed. Fusion may have been rather linear, but Other M feels as if it wants to discourage the player from exploring its environment, almost as if including these items and upgrades are merely an obligation or a second thought rather than being a defining trait to an entire subgenre of games. Other M is much more interested in pushing the player to the next story beat, as if Sakamoto is so excited he is figuratively pushing you along from behind. While it's bound to be more of a frustration to longtime fans rather than new ones, it continues to downplay part of what made Metroid such an iconic experience for players when they were younger. Perhaps Nintendo or Sakamoto don't have the faith to believe players want to explore and discover upgrades, ignoring the popularity of such collectible trinkets scattered across every other open world game to the AAA marketplace. The problem isn't that non-linear exploration or hidden item upgrades are too difficult for new players to figure out. The problem is that the players spending their time in Wii Sports are completely uninterested in such games to begin with. This leaves any player you could have feeling dissatisfied because the game is spending more time telling them not to explore than it is opening the gates and telling them to go crazy. It makes no logical sense that Samus would run into a volcano without activating her heat-shielding Variasuit. We know this, but I did want to touch on the idea that I believe Sakamoto and Team Ninja were going for, and that I can appreciate their effort. Traditionally in a Metroid game, you overcome a boss and then gain a new ability. It's standard video game logic, where overcoming a challenge earns the player a reward. It's also traditional storytelling, where the hero gains the prize that the ancient beast was guarding. But Sakamoto wanted to try a different sort of dramatic approach, or so I believe. In prior Metroid games, when you entered a heated zone, the natural response was to immediately turn back. In Other M, the player is instead in a heightened state of panic, trying to rush through a zone before losing too much health. It's only when encountering the zone's boss that the player gains the ability to use the Variasuit, removing the heat as a threat and allowing the player to feel energized to take on this new threat. I like to think of it as the Sailor Moon effect. The player is in a tense state where failure is a real possibility until Tuxedo Mask, or in this case Adam Malkovich, swoops in and reminds Sailor Moon, or in this case Samus, that the power was with her all along. In this case, literally. Which, unfortunately, is part of the problem. The drama only works if it makes logical sense within the game world. There's no reason Samus can't walk into that first heated room and activate the Variasuit. Similarly, there's no reason for her not to activate the grapple beam the first time she encounters an obstacle requiring it. The game could make note of a weak structural support or something, threatening the collapse of the entire room, but instead the player is just expected to turn and go somewhere else. In select brief moments, the intended drama works, but only because in those brief moments the player is too busy trying to survive to really think about the logic of the situation. Once the moment has passed, the player returns to cursing Adam, Team Ninja, and Nintendo. One of the reasons Sakamoto had chosen Team Ninja to develop Metroid Other M was because he saw a rising popularity in action games, at least possibly in Japan, because action games remain a bit of a niche in the West. Yet he also wanted to develop the game to be accessible and thus challenged Yosuke Hayashi to design the game using just the Wiimote. Using such a device to interact with the three-dimensional world is always going to be a challenge. You have to rely on Samus locking onto enemies automatically, an often imprecise process when fighting groups of smaller foes, or unreliable when your enemies are located off-screen. But instead of navigating a fully 3D environment, the player is instead navigating rooms that often take perspectives similar to a side-scroller. While not precisely what many writers and pundits refer to as 2.5D, it is a wonderful fusion of both 3-dimensional and 2-dimensional concepts that allow the player greater freedom of movement while also keeping the levels simple to navigate. Environments are designed around the camera, so all the player needs to see and focus on is front and center. Metroid Prime may have felt like a Metroid game in regards to exploration and narrative, but Other M feels like a proper evolution of Samus's movements and action. The player is actually able to interact with the environment, making Samus feel less like a hulking space marine and more like an agile space ninja, which is essentially what combat capitalizes on. Instead of simply being about shooting enemies, Team Ninja put a heavy emphasis on dodging. It's almost like an introduction to Bayonetta, only instead of slowing down time, the player's well-timed dodge can immediately charge Samus's arm cannon to let loose a devastating volley of energy. Samus is also able to leap onto certain foes or grab onto weak enemies and execute them in an empowering and cinematic fashion, often cutting the battle even shorter. All of this is easy to pull off, just requiring the player to leap or run into close enough proximity of the enemy. Leaping is a bit finicky and relies on more precise timing, but ultimately it's a simple maneuver to pull off, allowing a variety of players to take advantage of the mechanic with little effort. There's also a large window of time available to activate the dodge. Perhaps a bit too large and forgiving a window. As long as a player keeps tapping any direction, they'll inevitably dodge when the enemy attacks. It's not until some of the later foes start showing up that constantly tapping is not the most reliable strategy for evading damage. And evade the player must. When the player is struck, they tend to take quite a bit of damage, and foes don't drop restorative items in Other M. In fact, the only way to restore health is either at a save station or by recharging a small amount when there's only a small percentage remaining, a move that requires quite a gap of time during often hectic and fast-paced battles. It's a confusing design choice. It's a decent challenge for experienced players, but new players that are just starting to learn and get used to video game logic and developing the necessary reflexes and vocabulary for an action game are likely going to have a harder time of it. Chances are they'll die often, as they'll lose a lot of health trying to dodge and be unable to time their recharge properly. Other M isn't difficult like other Team Ninja games by any means, but it's certainly not accessible to a more casual Wii Sports playing audience. The real flaw of the combat is the first-person mode, the required method of not only seeking out hidden objects throughout the game, but also the only way to fire missiles at enemies. Each time the player must use missiles, there's a very limited window of time available. Samus is still and thus open to attack, and the amount of time it takes to point the Wiimote at the screen and the game to register the shift in position often takes a couple of seconds, long enough to already miss the window of opportunity to launch a missile. This is yet another design choice that could aggravate and even confuse new players, and this is assuming that conditions are perfect for the sensor bar to accurately pick up the Wii remote. The smallest problem, be it with the calibration or the placement of the sensor bar, can... God damn it. God damn it. The combat and overall feel of Samus is perhaps the best thing about Other M, and the entire reason I enjoy playing it at all. But even that isn't without its flaws, and many of the design choices are counterintuitive to the desire of accessibility. It, as well as all of the other issues with Other M, make the game a rather beautiful mess. By the time this video is complete, Nintendo may have already announced their plans for a new Metroid game. Whether they have or not, I'm sure they and their own developers have their own ideas as to what to do with the franchise. I think Nintendo's concern for new, more casual players is at an end though, or it's at least not the same as it was during the time of the Nintendo Wii. I think it's clear that, with the Nintendo Wii U, Nintendo is still trying to make fun games for players of all types and ages, but they're not trying to strong-arm all their properties into something built specifically for the Wii Sports crowd. Which is good, because Metroid is never going to be a franchise that interests that particular group. The tragedy of Metroid is that, as great of a property as it has been, it just hasn't sold. Perhaps it's a lack of marketing from Nintendo's part, but I think it's more likely that there are a lot of players out there that would enjoy Metroid games if it weren't for them being, well, I suppose Nintendo games on Nintendo platforms, or perhaps simply being that the nature of Metroid's upgrades and exploration are unappealing. Which is fine, that just means Nintendo treats Metroid like a proper niche property. It's possible we'll never get an expensive Metroid like the Prime games again, but I'd be satisfied with a game in the general style of Other M on a 3DS, but with improvements. Other M had a lot of good ideas and a lot of great mechanics. With changes to the narrative and approach to the world, I think a game of its design could be the greatest successor to Super Metroid we could ever have. Part of the problem with Metroid is, where do you go when the titular and iconic creature is supposedly extinct? Do you reboot it? Do you perhaps do something more with the Metroid DNA now in Samus' blood system? Do you allow someone to just clone it and bring the creatures back? The tragedy is, I don't know if Yoshio Sakamoto should be in charge of the franchise anymore. It may be cruel because he is the co-creator after all. In a lot of ways, I believe a creator should be permitted to experiment with their own creation. But regardless of the series' history, the truth remains that Metroid Prime and its successors were just better games than Metroid Other M. It's possible that the series has become such a thing in the minds of the players that it no longer fits the creative vision that Sakamoto has for game design. Either way, I don't expect Nintendo to give up on Samus. I can only hope, however, that they are capable of giving her a bright future.